When certain businesses start having a stranglehold over parts of our economy, like Wall Street or the insurance companies, which Mr. Johnson will defend any time, they were destroying small business. What led me to that health care bill? The constant complaints from Wisconsin businesses that the insurance industry was destroying their ability to cover their own employees. That's the ultimate pro-business position, and that's why I fight for them. So that's the opposite of an anti-business.
Let me go back to you.
First of all, I'm a small business person. I am Main Street. And he always talks, I'm in the back pocket of the insurance companies. No, I pay about $500,000 to health insurance companies. I want to make sure that we can get lower costs, bend that cost curve down. But the reason the tax cuts didn't work from the stimulus package is there was nothing else that this administration did that created any kind of certainty. Everything they've done have created a great deal of uncertainty in our economy. About the only level of certainty was when you spend $800 billion, eventually you're going to have to, when the government spends money, eventually you're going to have to take money. Taxes are going to have to go up, or inflation is going to explode. But again, they took this $800 billion, they threw it at the wall, hoping it would create jobs. It didn't. Then they spent the next year trying to take over 1/6 of our economy. They produced a 2,600-page bill that, part of that provision is 16,000 additional IRS agents. A new regulation that requires small business people to actually send out a 1099 form to anybody that they get a supply of more than $600 a year. Create a high level of uncertainty. They did not say the taxes weren't going to increase in 2011. That's a high level of uncertainty. They haven't taken cap and trade off the table. They certainly haven't taken card check off the table. So from a standpoint of a business person, from a standpoint of consumers are we going to have our jobs? Their 401ks aren't replenished, and business people certainly don't see any hope that this economy is going to grow. There's no certainty, there's no stability, so they're not going to invest.
You smiled when he said he's Main Street. Why did you smile?
Because he's not. He has no idea what's going on in Main Street in Wisconsin. I have been to every county in this state. I talked to the guy that tells me... Well, he certainly doesn't have the scope of experience I have in talking to businesses around the state. He may know his own business, and I don't question that. But, I go to the Walworth County Fair, I talk to the guy that's producing fences there. I thought, this guy's going to tell me the economy's a problem. He said, actually, Russ, it's going gangbusters. We're getting orders much later in the year than we normally do to make fences. I find the same thing in other places. There are certainly places where people are down, and there are certain businesses that are not going well. You go to Orion in Manitowoc. They're ecstatic about what's going on. You go to his own town of Oshkosh, and there's a company called Renewergy that is making wind turbines of a sort of middle size, and because of the stimulus bill, they're able to put their financing together. There's a lot of positive energy out there, and the worst thing we can do is depress it. I mean, the truth is, even though it's not fast enough, the private employment in this country has gone up every single month for 9 months, and Wisconsin's unemployment rate, although still way too high, is about 1.5 points lower than the national average. So
7.8%.
Right. So we can sit here and naysay and say nothing good has happened. The problem is, once again, it's not the truth. There are some good things happening, and we need to encourage those things, encourage things like water technology in this part of the state. And in Green Bay, this part of the state can be the Silicon Valley of water. And I've been very engaged with UWM and others to try to do that. So the truth is, I'm the candidate who's actually taken the time to learn about all the different kinds of businesses in the state. He has a very narrow focus of his own business and does not have that breadth of experience.
30 seconds, and then we're going to move on to audience questions.
I've done over 500 some events. I've visited all kinds of businesses, 60 counties. I've been doing this full time for 6 months. I mean, from sunup till well past sundown. I've visited countless businesses, and every time I ask them about this HIRE Act, I have yet to have one business executive, one person that actually creates jobs. Is this going to help? Is this going to prompt you to hire somebody? No, not one person yet has said that that's going to have any effect on them at all.
What I want to do now is weave in our citizen groups, because they have questions they would like to direct to the two of you. And we're going to begin tonight with Pam Warnke at WAOW-TV in Wausau. And this is, I think, an extension of the conversation we've been having. Pam, why don't you go ahead with your group's question?
It is an extension of what you've been talking about, Mike. John Fisher is here from Wausau, and this is a question that could make or break it for him. John, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Our question, what role, if any, do you feel federal housing policy played in the economic collapse? And what role, if any, do you feel federal housing policy should play in the economic recovery?
Mr. Johnson, we'll begin with you.
I think cause of collapse. If you go back in history in terms of what actually created the housing bubble, it was the federal government forcing banks, under threat of Department of Justice action to loan to people that couldn't afford the homes. And then right along, part and parcel of that, said, don't worry about that. We'll have Fannie and Freddie guarantee those loans, so you can actually offload those onto the other people. So the banks they had every incentive to make those loans and then offload them, and that's what created the housing bubble, together with very easy money. So the beginning of our economic problem here in 2008 really was caused by Washington. It was certainly propelled by the big banks. They saw an opportunity to make money, and unfortunately, it was paid for by the American taxpayer.
He says government was responsible. Your response?
It's very convenient, and it sort of fits his philosophy, because you let all the big corporations and everybody else that was involved off the hook. The fact is, Wall Street had something to do with this itself. The use of derivatives, which don't just relate to housing, is one of the greatest abuses we've ever seen. The fact that the Glass-Steagall Act was overturned, that was critical after the Depression. I was one of 8 senators to vote against it. That was the thing that made sure that investment houses and banks weren't merged. This notion that it was just government housing that did it. I've talked to a lot of people about this in Wisconsin, people that work on Wall Street. Nobody who is serious about this issue believes that it was just about the housing. However, I do think we need to reform this area. And when John McCain brought up an amendment on the financial regulation bill and said we ought to include these GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, within the category of those institutions, I was one of only, I believe, 2 Democrats to vote with him, because I thought, that's right. They may have played a role, but it simply, in my view, strains any credibility to suggest this was only because of that. It's just way too simple.
Very, very quickly, because Pam Warnke wants to jump in
again. And again, I didn't say it was only. I said the big banks certainly played a role. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, Congress's reaction to this thing was a 2,300-page bill that didn't even address the problems of Fannie and Freddie, and they certainly didn't address the too big to fail.
Well, we agree.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, when we had an entity called big bank that was termed too big to fail, regulation already failed.
Let me go back to Pam. Pam, did they get the answers they were looking for?
Well, let me ask John, who asked the question. Are they answering your question?
They answered the first part, but the second part, which is more important, is does housing policy play a role in the recovery?
Okay.
Well, certainly the housing sector will. And, housing, this is all going to have to work its way out. I mean, unfortunately, these homes have to be foreclosed on, and we're going to have to end up kind of bottoming out the pricing so people start buying homes again, and so the economy can take off. But what we need to do is we need to remove all the other uncertainty, caused by this administration's policies, caused by, the deciding votes that Senator Feingold cast for the stimulus, for the health care bill. We have got to make sure that we do not increase taxes in 2011. We've got to remove that uncertainty.
Housing is going to be critical. And Mr. Johnson has stated that he's willing to put the mortgage interest deduction on the table to get rid of it as part of tax reform. That is unacceptable to me. That is a tax increase that will have a devastating impact on housing and the ability to stimulate the housing market. And that is a huge difference between us, because throughout my career, I have never considered the possibility, even if it's horse trading, as you said in your own words, never considered the possibility of getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction. It is critical for our housing.
That is not true. I've not put the mortgage interest deduction on the table. Absolutely. I was talking about we need tax simplification.
I'm going to go to Green Bay now, and Tammy Elliott up there at WFRB TV. And Tammy has a question again. We're kind of continuing down the same path, but it's about decisions made and what we've learned from them. Tammy?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the candidates tonight. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created in 1934 on the heels of the Great Depression, and it has primary responsibility for enforcing the federal securities laws and also regulating the securities industry. Now, with our specific question, I have Howard Brown here from NINA, our group's question.
I have a question that asks the candidates to put themselves in the position of frontline government officials. If you were the chairman of the SEC, how would you expect Wall Street to self-regulate? And secondly, how would you direct the agency to do a more effective job of achieving its mission?
Senator Feingold, we'll begin with you.
Well, of course, I wouldn't expect or think that Wall Street could self-regulate. That's essentially what happened after the repeal of Glass-Steagall. It was like the OK Corral, and the government regulators didn't do their job properly. The problem is, though, that regulation and just having regulations often doesn't work. If there aren't absolute rules preventing certain things from happening, too often these regulators get co-opted by all the back and forth between Washington and New York of lobbyists being hired from Capitol staffers and back and forth, and these agencies get co-opted. So one of the reasons I was the only Democrat to vote against this financial regulation bill is it didn't make two basic rules. One is that Ron actually mentioned is to get rid of these too big to fail institutions. You need to do that. You can't just rely on regulation of them. The other is to get back to the rules we had ever since the Depression until 1999 to make sure that investment houses and banks are not allowed to intermingle. That distinction was critical. The fact that it was lost is important. So I think the regulators can do a very important job, but without those basic protections and prohibitions, I think their job becomes very, very difficult.
Mr. Johnson?
I think we're actually in pretty close agreement on this. Obviously, banks can't self-regulate. We need regulation. We need effective regulation, though. And what happened, with this 2,300-page financial regulation bill, it didn't address the problem. Again, we have antitrust laws on our books. The fact that any entity became termed too big to fail just proves that the regulation failed. So honestly, had I been in that position, I would have been looking back into the 70s, 80s, and 90s when the banks were operating properly. And rather than write new regulation, I would have gone back to see what worked back then. What worked with the regulations, the Glass-Steagall that was put in place after the Depression? That worked pretty well.
We're going to go to Channel 27 in Madison. Greg Jeske is there, and let's get a question from the Citizens Group who's joining us from Channel 27.
Mike, we had a good discussion about Social Security a couple of weeks ago. Started with someone mentioning that they had heard the latest target date for it to become insolvent, run out of money, 2037, according to the Social Security Board of Trustees. That is the target date at this point. And then we started talking about the fact that many people had heard and read about experts who had said that relatively minor changes relative to running out of money, relatively minor changes made now to the Social Security Fund could prevent it from running out of money. So Peggy Wireman of Monona has a question on this.
My question is, would you support making changes now to keep Social Security solvent? And if so, what specific changes would you support?
Yeah, and we'll ask you, Mr. Johnson, to begin, and we'll ask you both to be specific. This is one of these issues you hear a lot about during the campaign, but let's talk specifics.
Well, again, because I'm always accused, I have to first predicate my comments by the fact that promises have been made to seniors. People are retired, about to retire, and we have every capability in this country of honoring those promises, and we should. And secondly, the fact of the matter is the fiscal problems in Social Security have been known for decades. And instead of actually addressing the problem, Senator Feingold has used Social Security as a political football. And what's happened in just his tenure, over 18 years, the Social Security system has taken in $2.2 trillion in taxes, more than they've paid out in benefits, and they spent the money on other programs. And when you talk about Social Security being solvent until 2039, that's based on these Treasury bills that really are no more than an additional claim on the American taxpayer. So the American taxpayer was taxed once to the tune of $2.2 trillion, and in order to replenish it, they're going to have to be taxed again. So
what do we do about it?
So what you need to do is you need to look at all the options except for I would not agree to a job-killing payroll tax increase, and I would never force privatization on anybody. But again, all the other options would be on the table, and that'd be just a mixture of all of those in terms of how you make this thing long-term sustainable. And the good news is, as you're talking to young people, they don't think there will even be Social Security for them, so there'll be a receptive audience for structural change to make this sustainable long-term.
Senator Feingold, what do we do?
Where I come from, saying all options are on the table does not constitute being specific. Okay? In every area of policy, Mr. Johnson wants to be your senator, will not tell you what he wants to do on jobs, will not tell you what he wants to do to fix the health care system. And on this one, it's almost incredible to me that he cannot answer your question. I will answer your question. I think we need to raise that FICA level, that payroll tax level that he rejects to protect upper-income people, above $106,000 to help fund the future of Social Security. The reason this fund actually is solvent, despite your scare tactic for older people, is that this was done well before I was involved in politics. Commission was put together, and they said, we're going to have to raise that FICA level. That what comes out of your check for the payroll tax. When I came back and started working in Madison,